Welcome to the Catholic Intellectual Tradition Symposium, and our next presenter is a winner of this year's Father Jack McGrath SM Award. So I'll say just a brief word about the award. Here's Father McGrath up on the screen. The award is sponsored by my office. I'm Dr. Tim Gabrielli and the Gudorf Chair in Catholic Intellectual Traditions. And it's named in honor of Father Jack McGrath, who's a UD alumnus and also a faculty member and a Marianist here at UD for many years. He was born in 1935, as you can see, and died in 2015. And across his career, which spanned really like 60 years, Father McGrath taught high schoolers, undergraduates, and graduate students in a range of disciplines, including math and American history and theology. And he began, among many other roles that he held in the Society of Mary, he began as a faculty member here at UD in 1987, where he founded the Forum for the Catholic Intellectual Tradition today. So the award named in his honor recognizes students whose research in a common academic program course demonstrates careful, deep, and creative engagement with thinkers' texts and/or themes associated with Catholic intellectual traditions. So, having applied this past fall semester with work completed in a CAP course in spring, summer, fall 2022, this year's recipients were selected from a very strong pool of submitted research projects. So each recipient receives a $500 award along with a special medallion. And this medallion on its front has an image of a statue, a small statue that was very special to Father McGrath. That has been passed on to my colleague and co-sponsor of the symposium, Dr. Sandra Yoakum. The image is one of Mary's seat of wisdom, as Mary with baby Jesus on her lap. And this ancient title for Mary, seat of wisdom, reminds us all that those who stand in the Marianist tradition of education esteem the pursuit of wisdom as an encounter with God. As we learn and grow, we really come to meet God. So let me say just a few words about our recipient who will present to us in just a moment. So his name is Jacob Kulig. Jacob is a senior from Talmadge, Ohio, majoring in mechanical engineering with a concentration in aerospace engineering. He completed his award-winning research for Philosophy 308, Metaphysics in Context, with Professor Sayed Maisami. His research is titled Time in Religious Philosophy, a comparison of St. Augustine and Avicenna. It's my honor on behalf of the McGrath Award Committee to present you, Jacob, with the 2023 McGrath Award for Common Academic Program Research in Catholic Intellectual Traditions. Congratulations, Jacob. And I'll turn things over to Jacob to share his research with you.
Thank you, Dr. Gabrielli. As he said, I'm Jacob. I'm a senior here at the University of Dayton, studying mechanical engineering. And thank you for coming this morning. I'll be presenting my research, which was on St. Augustine and Avicenna for Dr. Mason B's class. So throughout this class, we found that time had been a theme throughout metaphysics as far back as ancient Greece. But this continued both in Western and Islamic traditions. Two of the most influential thinkers, arguably, in these traditions are these two philosophers, and both had much to say on the theory of time, what is time, how do we experience it. But there wasn't too many direct comparisons between the two. I wanted to look more into that. So I began with St. Augustine, and he lays out his theory of time in his work, Confessions, Book 11. He's writing around, or just after 400 AD, and his goal from the sources available wasn't really to create a philosophical document. It was more to create a spiritual guide for his close friends and associates. However, his work definitely had philosophical implications that are still relevant today. When he was looking into the theory of time and what is time, he really began with a question. And that was, what was God doing before he made heaven and earth. People would ask, what is happening? What did he do for all the ages and ages before the world was created? And through his reasoning, through his prayer, he found that the question, it doesn't make sense the way it's worded. He realized that time is a part of creation. It's something that God created. So there couldn't be countless ages before he created time. So he wasn't doing anything for all of that time because that time didn't exist. What this means really is that there's two big consequences to that conclusion. The first, this separates God from time and God from creation. Time is no longer something that God is subject to. It's something that religious events can be outside of. And second, it means that time is more closely related to creation than it is perhaps to God, even though both, of course, in his faith would have been created by God. And from that perspective, it's very similar to many modern interpretations of time that have come out of modern physics, where it's relativistic. Time and space are considered very closely related. Now, of course, St. Augustine didn't want to stop there, and he continued to see how time would be experienced by humans if this was the case. He noted that when we talk about time, we talk about length. But to have time, there's a present and a future and a past. And any present, no matter how small you get, can't have length, because then it would have a beginning and an end, and that is past and future. So you realize that the human experience of time is the rate of things changing rather than some sort of length. And the length that we measure is relative to our own passage of the world around us. As he said, it's not the things themselves, their passage that we're measuring, it's the kind of the impress on our human minds that we see. On the other hand, we have Avicenna. Writing a couple hundred years later, he lays out his theory of time in his work, The Physics of the Healing, specifically in chapters 10 through 13, chapters, not books. And his theory, instead of starting with a religious question, he's starting with the questions that Aristotle posed about time, and was working to sort out the inconsistencies that he saw and answer some of the unsolved questions that were posed. And his main conclusion comes to what sounds like a rather scientific statement, and it's that time is the number of motion when it is differentiated into earlier and later parts. Not by time, but instead with respect to distance. And what I think he's saying here is, if you think of a ball rolling, you can measure the duration of its motion, so the time that it's traveling. But you can also measure the distance. And the time measurement is completely separate from your distance. With that, time is something that he says is slightly separate from physical dimensions. But it's still a numerical quantity, a mathematical, measurable item that we can observe. So he continues from that conclusion to ask what this magnitude is. And he comes to the conclusion that this is the same thing that in midst of before and after. This is very similar concepts to what St. Augustine was saying, where you have before and after and present, and these all somehow related to time. This conclusion is very similar to drawing a line on paper. You're dividing the paper into two. You have one side and the other side. You have your line kind of time, in some sense. But as I mentioned, they have these similar concepts, even if they come to them in slightly different ways. And I was trying to explain what that's like, how, and throughout their work, they seem to be coming from different directions, and yet they're coming to very similar concepts, even if they describe them differently. And what I found is that Augustine's kind of coming to a conclusion about how we experience time, but that's applied more generally to what time is and how it relates to the created world. Avicenna, on the other hand, is coming to a conclusion more about the nature of time specifically that can be applied to how we experience it in everyday life. And I was trying to explain this to one of my friends in class, Will. And he said, okay, that makes sense, but no one's going to understand what you're talking about. Not in the slightest. So it's like a chocolate bar. I looked at him and I said, what? That makes no sense. And he explained it to me. If St. Augustine was describing a chocolate bar, he would explain to you what it tastes like, what it feels like, the experience you get, how it makes you feel, what the wrapper sounds like. If Avicenna was explaining to you the chocolate bar, he'd tell you what it's made of, where it came from, what the packaging's made of, why it's that shape, all the little details. And from that, you could get a pretty good idea of what the experience of eating a chocolate bar is like. And that's pretty much the same way that they describe time. Augustine's explaining how we experience it to get a conclusion on what it is. And Avicenna is explaining what it is to get a conclusion on how we experience it. And in that process, they're really not so different. They both see time as part of creation from their religious perspective. Avicenna goes as far as to say time is material. They also find that both find that God is separate from time. And they both find a philosophical basis for past, present, and future concepts. And really this is important because these impact the philosophy of time today. As I mentioned, it may have inspired some of the relativistic theories in physics. And of course, they're major thinkers who both traditions are based on to this very day. So looking at these issues, we've seen not only the differences, not only the similarities, but also the different ways of thinking that can lead to very similar conclusions. So thank you very much for your time. Do you have any questions?
I've got one. First, thank you. That was excellent. I went to an Augustine in high school in the Chicagoland area, so I've long had a fascination with Augustine and time, and you did an excellent job in clearly delineating those differences. I'm curious with your major with mechanical engineering and aerospace, how has studying people like Augustine and Avicenna and like Dr. Masani's classes and these other courses affected how you view your work in engineering? Has it affected how you view aerospace? So it's a little bit different way of approaching things, but the Catholic and electronic tradition, all these things exist in relationship in pretty cool ways. So have you thought about how like this kind of affects your other work?
I wouldn't say specifically.
Okay.
I think I'll learn the effect in time. I only took this last semester.
That's fair.
But I would say the big thing, just realizing how much they came to conclusions from different perspectives, from different parts of the world at different times, and seeing how sometimes you can think about things differently and still come to useful conclusions that you can share and have shared ground. This is something that you can see all throughout all of my work. It's not just in CAT classes. It
Sure.
definitely bleeds over into aerospace and mechanical engineering.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Jacob, thanks for this presentation. This is difficult stuff that you're dealing with here, and you did such a nice job of offering examples and wrestling with the positions of these two thinkers. And what I found particularly impressive about your work and your presentation, your research, is this point that you made about, sometimes we like to kind of imagine history as this like break with the Enlightenment, and all of a sudden we get the scientific method and we get Enlightenment philosophy, and we get a whole different way of thinking about things, and we, from Newton on forward, we get, as you said, this sort of relativistic theory of time and contemporary physics. But here you're showing actually at least those seeds of this way of thinking about time. I mean, go back to Augustine in the 4th century, Avicenna picks them up in the Middle Ages, right? I love that way that you're telling that story. What I thought was really interesting here, and you mentioned how different these figures are. We've got, a Christian and a Muslim. We've got maybe, a late antiquity, very early medieval figure in Augustine, to a high Middle Ages figure in Avicenna, and how they come at this different ways, but then come together. One of the things you said when you were talking about the chocolate bar and Avicenna is you said Avicenna would pay attention to the little details and would start describing those details there in order to get to the big picture. And I wondered if your sense was that, this is Avicenna's sort of Aristotelian influenced philosophy versus, say, Augustine's more Platonic approach. I mean, when you were describing the chocolate bar, do you see that as reflected there, kind of more of a Platonic, gut instinct from Augustine and a more Aristotelian gut instinct from Avicenna?
So I haven't studied enough philosophy to see it by myself, but now that you mention it, absolutely. It definitely seems to be a reflection in there.
Yeah. I thought that example brought that together so well. I mean, of course, Aristotle's Plato's student, and sometimes the differences are overdrawn, but that move to, I always think of Aristotle sort of cataloging sea life on the shores, the details about them, and Plato talking about being liberated from the cave and getting beyond the shadows, right, to be able to perceive the form and its reflection. I thought your example of the chocolate bar really kind of brought home that distinction in essence. So thanks. Other comments or questions for Jacob? I guess it just remains to thank him again.